At 25,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Sarah Chen's fighter jet shuddered violently as enemy missiles streaked past her cockpit. Her fuel gauge blinked red, her radio crackled with static, and 7 hostile aircraft circled her like vultures. Military historians would later call it the most impossible aerial combat survival in modern warfare. But on that terrifying morning in 2003, Sarah Chen wasn't thinking about making history. She was thinking about staying alive long enough to see her daughter's 5th birthday. What happened next defied every rule of air combat engagement. A single pilot, outnumbered 7-1, with failing equipment and dwindling ammunition, would turn the hunter into the hunted in the most dramatic reversal ever recorded in aerial warfare. This is her story. The morning sun painted the Pacific Ocean in brilliant gold as Lieutenant Sarah Chen completed her pre-flight checklist at Naval Air Station Oceana. Her F-18 Super Hornet gleamed on the tarmac, freshly fueled and armed for what was supposed to be a routine patrol mission. Sarah had completed this same mission dozens of times over the past 18 months. She was one of the Navy's top pilots, known for her steady nerves and exceptional flying skills. Sarah's squadron commander, Captain Rick Morrison, approached her aircraft as she secured her helmet. Morrison was a veteran pilot with 20 years of experience and had personally trained Sarah when she first joined the squadron. He carried a thermos of coffee and wore his characteristic grin. "Beautiful morning for flying, Chen," Morrison called out over the sound of jet engines warming up across the flight line. "Weather's perfect, visibility unlimited. Should be a milk run today." Sarah nodded, though something felt different about this mission. She couldn't explain the uneasiness that had settled in her stomach since waking up. Her daughter Emma had clung to her longer than usual during their morning goodbye, asking when Mummy would be home. Sarah had promised to be back in time for dinner and Emma's piano recital practice. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Sarah and her wingman, Lieutenant Jack Rodriguez, were assigned to patrol the southeastern quadrant of their operational area, approximately 200 miles off the coast. Intelligence reports indicated all enemy activity had been quiet for the past week. No hostile aircraft had been detected in their sector for over a month. It was exactly the kind of routine patrol that allowed pilots to maintain their flight hours without significant risk. Sarah climbed into her cockpit and began the startup sequence. The familiar sounds and vibrations of the powerful engines coming to life always gave her a sense of confidence. She had logged over 1,200 flight hours in the F-18, and the aircraft felt like an extension of her own body. Every switch, every gauge, every control response was second nature to her. Rodriguez's voice crackled through her headset as his aircraft taxied into position beside hers.
"Looking good, Chen. Ready to go bore ourselves to death for 4 hours?"
Sarah laughed despite her lingering uneasiness.
Rodriguez was known throughout the squadron for his humor and his ability to lighten even the most tense situations. He was also an excellent pilot and someone Sarah trusted completely to watch her back during missions. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and Sarah felt the familiar rush of acceleration as her afterburners kicked in and the F-18 lifted off the runway. The sensation of leaving the ground never got old, no matter how many times she experienced it. Within minutes, they were climbing through 10,000 feet, the Virginia coastline shrinking below them. As they reached their patrol altitude of 25,000 feet, Sarah settled into the routine of scanning instruments and maintaining communication with ground control. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, a deep blue carpet broken only by occasional whitecaps. The weather was indeed perfect, with unlimited visibility and calm winds. For the first 2 hours of the patrol, everything proceeded exactly as expected. Sarah and Rodriguez flew their assigned pattern, checking in with air traffic control at regular intervals and monitoring their radar screens for any signs of activity. The most exciting event was spotting a commercial airliner passing 15,000 feet below them, heading toward Europe. Sarah found herself thinking about Emma's piano recital. Her daughter had been practicing a simple piece by Mozart for weeks, and Sarah had promised to help her prepare for the performance at school next week. These quiet moments during patrol flights often gave her time to think about life outside the cockpit, about the future she was building with her daughter. Rodriguez's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Chen, I'm picking up something weird on radar. Multiple contacts, bearing 270, approximately 80 miles out." Sarah immediately focused on her instruments. Her radar screen showed several blips moving in their direction at high speed. The contacts appeared and disappeared intermittently, suggesting they might be flying at low altitude to avoid detection. "Ground control, this is Viper Flight," Sarah radioed. "We have multiple unknown contacts approaching from the west. Request identification and instructions." The response from ground control sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Viper Flight, those contacts are not showing on our scope. Maintain current position and continue monitoring. Do not engage unless engaged first. Sarah exchanged glances with Rodriguez through their cockpit canopies, though they were too far apart to see each other clearly. Unknown aircraft that didn't appear on ground radar were rarely good news. It suggested either advanced stealth technology or aircraft flying so low they were hidden by the Earth's curvature. As the minutes passed, the unknown contacts grew closer and began to climb, appearing more clearly on Sarah's radar. She counted at least 6 distinct aircraft, all moving at military jet speeds and maintaining formation. Their flight pattern was aggressive and purposeful, not the random movement of lost civilian aircraft.
Rodriguez, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Sarah asked, her training taking over as she began calculating intercept courses and escape routes. Affirmative.
6 contacts, possibly 7. They're definitely military aircraft based on their speed and formation. And Chen? Rodriguez paused, his voice becoming more serious. They're not broadcasting any identification codes. Sarah's heart rate increased as the implications became clear. Any friendly aircraft in their area would be broadcasting identification codes and would have been coordinated through air traffic control. The approaching aircraft were either lost friendlies with malfunctioning equipment or they were hostile. Ground control's voice crackled through their headsets with new urgency. Viper Flight, we're now tracking your contacts. Preliminary analysis suggests non-friendly aircraft. Maintain defensive posture and be prepared for evasive action. Sarah's hands tightened on her controls as she watched the unknown aircraft continue their approach. Her training had prepared her for this moment, but the reality of facing potentially hostile aircraft was different from any simulation. These weren't practice targets or imaginary enemies. These were real aircraft with real pilots who might be intent on shooting her down. The lead aircraft in the enemy formation suddenly accelerated and climbed directly towards Sarah's position. On her radar screen, she could see the other 6 aircraft spreading out in what appeared to be a coordinated attack pattern. Rodriguez, they're going hostile, Sarah called out as the first enemy aircraft launched a missile in her direction. The peaceful morning patrol had suddenly become a fight for survival. Sarah rolled her aircraft hard to the right, releasing chaff and flares to confuse the incoming missile. The projectile streaked past her cockpit, missing by less than 500 feet. Rodriguez was already engaging the second enemy aircraft, his missiles lighting up the sky as the aerial battle began in earnest. Sarah found herself facing off against 5 remaining enemy fighters, all converging on her position with deadly intent. As she prepared to fire her first shot in anger, Sarah thought briefly of Emma waiting at home for her return. The routine patrol mission had become something no amount of training could have fully prepared her for. She was about to fight for her life against overwhelming odds, 25,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, with nowhere to run and no backup within hundreds of miles. The real test of her skills, courage, and will to survive was just beginning. The first missile that streaked past Sarah's cockpit was just the beginning of what would become the most intense aerial combat of her career. As she rolled her F-18 hard to avoid the incoming projectile, she caught a glimpse of the enemy aircraft that had fired it. The sleek fighter jet was unlike anything she had seen in intelligence briefings, suggesting these were either experimental aircraft or belonging to a nation with advanced military technology. Sarah's training kicked in automatically as she executed a series of defensive maneuvers while simultaneously trying to get weapons lock on the attacking aircraft. Her radar warning receiver was screaming warnings about multiple missile launches and targeting radars painting her aircraft. The peaceful blue sky had transformed into a deadly arena, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Rodriguez's voice came through her headset, strained with the effort of pulling high G-forces while engaged in combat. Chen, I've got 3 on my tail. These guys are good, really good. Their aircraft are fast and maneuverable. Sarah glanced at her radar screen while pulling a tight turn to avoid another incoming missile. Rodriguez was indeed in trouble, with multiple enemy aircraft pursuing him aggressively. But Sarah had her own problems. 2 enemy fighters were closing on her position from different angles, trying to trap her in a pincer movement that would make escape impossible. The enemy pilots were clearly experienced and well-trained. Their tactics were sophisticated, and they were using their numerical advantage effectively. Instead of all attacking at once in a chaotic melee, they were coordinating their attacks to prevent Sarah and Rodriguez from using their superior training and equipment to even the odds. Sarah leapt onto the closest enemy aircraft and fired her first missile in combat, the AIM. 120, AMRAAM streaked away from her aircraft, leaving a white contrail in the clear air. She watched with satisfaction as the missile tracked perfectly toward its target. The enemy pilot tried to evade with a series of sharp turns and defensive countermeasures, but Sarah's shot was true. The explosion was visible even from several miles away. A bright orange flash, followed by a spreading cloud of black smoke and debris. Sarah's first confirmed kill in aerial combat sent a surge of adrenaline through her system. But there was no time to celebrate. The remaining enemy aircraft immediately became more aggressive, apparently abandoning their careful tactics in favor of overwhelming firepower. "Rodriguez, where are you?" Sarah called out, unable to spot her wingman's aircraft in the chaos of the aerial battle. "I'm hit," Rodriguez responded, his voice tight with pain and concentration. "Lost hydraulics and my navigation system is down. I'm trying to make it back to base, but I don't think I'm going to make it." Sarah's heart sank as she realized Rodriguez was effectively out of the fight. Her wingman was struggling just to keep his damaged aircraft in the air, leaving her alone against 6 remaining enemy fighters. The odds had just gotten significantly worse, and she was still more than 150 miles from the nearest friendly base. 2 enemy aircraft were now closing on her from ahead, while another pair approached from her rear quarter. The classic bracket maneuver was designed to force her into the firing solution of at least one of the attacking aircraft, no matter which way she turned. Sarah knew she had only seconds to break out of the trap before multiple missiles would be launched at her simultaneously. She made a decision that went against conventional tactics, but might give her a fighting chance. Instead of turning left or right to avoid the bracket, Sarah pulled her aircraft into a vertical climb, using her F-18's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to escape the trap by going straight up. The enemy aircraft, not expecting such an aggressive maneuver, overshot her position and briefly lost their firing solutions. The vertical climb gave Sarah a momentary advantage, but it also cost her speed and energy. As she reached the top of her climb and began to fall back down, she found herself in an even more dangerous position. The enemy aircraft had regrouped and were now climbing to intercept her as she descended. Sarah rolled inverted and pulled through into a steep dive, building speed while keeping the enemy aircraft in sight. Her aircraft was now screaming toward the ocean at over 600 miles per hour, with 4 enemy fighters in pursuit. She waited until the last possible moment, then pulled out of the dive in a crushing 7G turn that pushed her body hard against her ejection seat. The high-G maneuver was almost more than her body could handle. Her vision began to grey out as the blood was forced from her head, and she had to fight to maintain consciousness. But the maneuver worked. 2 of the pursuing enemy aircraft were unable to match her turn rate and overshot her position, giving her another brief opportunity to engage. Sarah immediately rolled to bring her weapons to bear on the closest enemy fighter. The pilot was good, already beginning evasive maneuvers before Sarah could achieve missile lock. But Sarah was better. She had trained extensively in air-to-air combat and had an intuitive feel for the 3-dimensional chess game of aerial warfare. Instead of trying for a difficult long-range missile shot, Sarah closed the distance and switched to her 20mm cannon. The enemy pilot realized what was happening and tried to escape by diving toward the ocean. But Sarah stayed with him, matching every turn and maneuver. When she finally had a clear shot, she squeezed the trigger and watched as her cannon rounds found their target. The enemy aircraft exploded in a ball of flame and debris, marking Sarah's second confirmed kill of the engagement. But her success was short-lived. The remaining enemy aircraft had used her focus on the single target to reposition themselves for another coordinated attack. Sarah's fuel gauge was now showing yellow, indicating she had burned through a significant amount of her fuel during the intense maneuvering of the aerial combat. She estimated she had perhaps 30 minutes of flight time remaining before she would be forced to eject over the open ocean. The enemy pilots seemed to realize her predicament and were now flying more defensively, apparently content to wait for her fuel to run out. The tactical situation was becoming desperate. Sarah was alone against 5 experienced enemy pilots. Her fuel was running low, and she was still far from any friendly territory. Her aircraft had taken some damage from near-miss explosions, and several of her warning systems were showing amber caution lights. But Sarah Chen had not become one of the Navy's top pilots by giving up when the situation looked hopeless. She had always been known for her aggressive flying style and her ability to think creatively under pressure. As she watched the enemy aircraft maneuvering around her, she began to formulate a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. The enemy pilots were flying a defensive pattern, staying spread out to prevent her from engaging multiple targets quickly. But their formation also had a weakness. They were so focused on maintaining their advantage that they had become predictable in their movements. Sarah began to climb again, gaining altitude while the enemy aircraft followed at a safe distance. She was using her remaining fuel to gain potential energy, trading her most precious resource for position and options. The enemy pilots seemed content to shadow her climb, probably assuming she was trying to escape to high altitude, where she could glide further when her fuel ran out. What the enemy pilots didn't realize was that Sarah was setting up for the most aggressive aerial combat maneuver of her career. She was about to turn the tables on her pursuers in a way that would either save her life or end it spectacularly. At 35,000 feet, with her fuel gauge now showing red, Sarah suddenly rolled inverted and pulled into the steepest dive of her life. Sarah's F-18 screamed toward the ocean in a near-vertical dive that pushed her aircraft to its structural limits. The enemy fighters followed her down, but they were cautious, probably assuming she was making a desperate attempt to escape or that her aircraft was damaged and out of control. They had no idea that Sarah was executing the most dangerous maneuver of her career, one that could either turn the tide of the battle or end her life in the next 60 seconds. As her airspeed indicator climbed past 700 miles per hour, Sarah's aircraft began to shake violently. The F-18 was approaching its maximum safe diving speed, and the stress on the airframe was enormous. Her altimeter spun rapidly downward as she plummeted toward the Pacific Ocean. At this rate of descent, she had perhaps 30 seconds before she would have to pull out of the dive or impact the water. The enemy pilots were following her down, but they were maintaining what they thought was a safe distance. They probably believed they could simply wait for Sarah to either pull out of the dive and expose herself to their weapons, or continue diving until she crashed into the ocean. Either way, they thought the aerial battle was essentially over. What the enemy pilots didn't know was that Sarah had studied their aircraft during the previous engagements. She had noticed that their fighters, while fast and maneuverable, seemed to have limitations in high-speed dives. Their aircraft appeared to be optimized for sustained flight rather than the extreme performance envelope that Sarah was now exploring. At 15,000 feet and still diving, Sarah began her desperate gambit. Instead of pulling out of the dive as the enemy pilots expected, she suddenly rolled her aircraft and pulled into a crushing HG turn while still descending at high speed. The maneuver was incredibly dangerous and pushed both her aircraft and her body to their absolute limits. The G-forces were so intense that Sarah's vision tunneled, and she felt on the verge of losing consciousness. Her anti-G suit inflated to help maintain blood flow to her brain, but the sustained high-G loading was almost more than she could handle. Her hands felt like they weighed 100 pounds each as she fought to maintain control of her aircraft. The extreme maneuver had exactly the effects Sarah had hoped for. The enemy aircraft, trying to follow her unexpected turn while still in a high-speed dive, found themselves in an impossible situation. Their aircraft simply could not match the performance of Sarah's F-18 under these extreme conditions. Two of the enemy fighters lost control trying to match Sarah's turn. One aircraft entered an unrecoverable spin and began tumbling toward the ocean. Sarah watched as the pilot ejected just moments before his aircraft hit the water in a spectacular explosion. The second aircraft managed to avoid crashing, but was forced to level off and disengage from the fight to recover control. Sarah pulled out of her dive at less than 2,000 feet above the ocean, so low that she could see individual whitecaps on the waves below. Her aircraft was vibrating from the stress of the extreme maneuver, and several more warning lights had illuminated on her instrument panel. But she was alive, and she had reduced the odds against her from 5-1 to 3-1. The remaining enemy pilots were clearly shaken by the loss of two of their aircraft in a matter of seconds. They had gone from hunters to being hunted, and Sarah could see their formation beginning to show signs of uncertainty. They were no longer flying the confident, coordinated attacks of the early engagement. Sarah used their momentary confusion to climb back to a more favorable altitude while assessing the condition of her aircraft. Her fuel situation was now critical, with perhaps 15 minutes of flight time remaining. Several of her aircraft systems were showing damage from the extreme maneuvering, but the F-18 was still flyable and her weapon systems were operational. The enemy pilots regrouped and began another attack, but their tactics had changed. They were now flying more defensively, apparently recognizing that Sarah was far more dangerous than they had initially assumed. Instead of the aggressive bracket attacks they had used earlier, they were now trying to engage her from long range with missiles, while staying out of the envelope where she could use her superior flying skills against them. Sarah realized she needed to end this fight quickly. Her fuel situation meant she couldn't afford a prolonged engagement, and the enemy pilots seemed content to wait her out. She needed to force them into close combat where her skills and her aircraft's capabilities could overcome their numerical advantage. She began flying a seemingly random pattern, making sudden turns and altitude changes that appeared erratic and unpredictable. To the enemy pilots, it probably looked like her aircraft was damaged or that she was panicking.
But Sarah was actually executing a complex tactical maneuver designed to separate the enemy aircraft and force them to engage her individually rather than as a coordinated group. The tactic worked better than she had hoped.
The enemy pilots, thinking she was vulnerable, began to close in for what they thought would be easy kills. Instead of maintaining their disciplined formation, they spread out to attack her from multiple angles simultaneously. Sarah waited until the enemy aircraft were committed to their attack runs, then suddenly reversed course and flew directly at the closest fighter. The head-on pass happened so quickly that neither pilot had time for more than a snapshot with their weapons. But Sarah's shot was accurate, and her 20mm cannon rounds tore through the enemy aircraft's engine. The damaged enemy fighter began trailing smoke and fire as its pilot fought to maintain control. Sarah could see the pilot struggling with his aircraft, probably trying to decide whether to continue fighting or attempt to return to base. She made the decision for him, firing a missile that tracked perfectly to its target and exploded the aircraft in a brilliant fireball. 3 enemy aircraft remained, but their confidence was clearly shaken. They had started the engagement with a 7-1 advantage and overwhelming superiority. Now they were down to 3 aircraft against a single pilot who had already demonstrated that she was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Sarah's fuel gauge was now flashing red, indicating that she had perhaps 10 minutes of flight time remaining. She was still over 100 miles from the nearest friendly base, and even if she started flying directly toward home immediately, she might not have enough fuel to make it back. But Sarah Chen had not survived this long by playing it safe. She was going to finish what the enemy pilots had started, even if it meant risking everything in the process. The 3 remaining enemy aircraft were reforming for what would probably be their final coordinated attack. They undoubtedly knew about her fuel situation and were planning to make one last effort to shoot her down before she could escape. Sarah checked her weapon status and found that she had 2 missiles and approximately 200 rounds of 20mm ammunition remaining. It would have to be enough. She was about to engage 3 experienced enemy pilots in what would either be the conclusion of her victory or the end of her life. As the enemy aircraft began their final attack run, Sarah thought briefly of Emma waiting at home for her return. Then she focused all of her attention on the tactical situation developing around her. The next few minutes would determine whether she lived to see her daughter again. The 3 remaining enemy aircraft approached in a tight formation that spoke of desperation and determination. Their pilots had watched 4 of their colleagues shot down by a single American pilot, and they were clearly intent on ending the engagement decisively. Sarah could see them on her radar screen, flying a textbook attack pattern designed to overwhelm her defensive capabilities through coordinated missile launches from multiple angles. Sarah's fuel situation had reached critical levels. Her engines were now running on fumes, and she estimated she had no more than 5 minutes of flight time remaining before flameout. The nearest friendly airfield was still over 80 miles away, an impossible distance given her fuel state. She was going to have to finish this fight here and now, or eject into the Pacific Ocean and hope for rescue. The enemy pilots seemed to recognize her desperate situation and were flying more aggressively than they had since the beginning of the engagement. They probably assumed that her low fuel state would force her into defensive tactics, making her an easier target for their coordinated attack. They were about to learn that Sarah Chen's response to desperation was not defense, but an even more aggressive offense. As the enemy aircraft closed to missile range, Sarah did something that went against every principle of aerial combat tactics. Instead of turning away to avoid their weapons envelope, she turned directly toward the enemy formation and accelerated to maximum speed. The head-on attack was either brilliant or suicidal, and Sarah would know which in the next 30 seconds. The enemy pilots were clearly surprised by her aggressive maneuver. Their formation began to spread apart as each pilot tried to avoid the head-on collision course while simultaneously maintaining weapons lock on Sarah's aircraft. The coordinated attack that they had planned suddenly became a chaotic melee as their careful tactics dissolved into individual survival instincts. Sarah fired her first missile at the lead enemy aircraft while still in the head-on pass. The AIM-9 Sidewinder tracked perfectly, and she watched with grim satisfaction as the enemy fighter exploded in a ball of flame and debris. The explosion was so close that pieces of the destroyed aircraft peppered Sarah's F-18, causing additional damage to her already stressed airframe. The remaining 2 enemy pilots immediately went into evasive maneuvers, abandoning their attack in favor of survival. But Sarah was not done. She rolled inverted and pulled through in pursuit of the second enemy aircraft, which was diving toward the ocean in an attempt to escape. Her last missile streaked away from her aircraft and caught the fleeing fighter just as it began to level off above the waves.
The explosion of the sixth enemy aircraft marked a turning point that neither Sarah nor the remaining enemy pilot could have anticipated. The lone surviving enemy fighter suddenly broke off all aggressive maneuvers and began flying away from the engagement area at maximum speed.
The pilot had apparently decided that continuing the fight against someone who had just single-handedly destroyed 6 aircraft was not a viable option. Sarah wanted to pursue the fleeing aircraft, but her fuel situation made that impossible. Her engines were running on the last drops of fuel in her tanks, and she could feel the aircraft beginning to lose power.
She had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before complete engine failure, and she was still over 70 miles from the nearest land. As she turned toward home and began calculating glide ratios and ejection points, Sarah's radio crackled with a voice she had not heard since the beginning of the engagement. Rodriguez was still alive, and his damaged aircraft had somehow remained airborne despite the severe damage he had sustained.
Chen, this is Rodriguez. I've been monitoring your engagement on emergency frequency. Jesus Christ, what did you just do out there? His voice was weak but alive, and Sarah felt a surge of relief that her wingman had survived.
Rodriguez, what's your status? Sarah responded while nursing her failing engines and calculating her chances of making it back to base. I'm about 40 miles southeast of your position, flying on backup systems and prayers. My aircraft is barely holding together, but I think I can make it back. What about you? Your fuel situation has got to be desperate after that engagement. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge, which was now showing empty. Her engines were running on fuel vapors and the residual fuel in the lines. She had perhaps 1 minute of powered flight remaining before she would be forced to glide. Rodriguez, I'm running on fumes. Going to try to make it as far as possible before I have to punch out.
If I don't make it back, tell Emma I kept my promise to come home. But as Sarah prepared for the inevitable ejection over the Pacific Ocean, she spotted something on the horizon that changed everything. A U.S. Navy destroyer was visible in the distance, probably responding to the emergency calls that had been going out during the aerial engagement. The ship was still 15 miles away, but it represented hope for rescue if she had to eject. More importantly, the destroyer's presence meant that other friendly forces were probably en route to the area. Sarah's radio suddenly came alive with multiple voices as rescue aircraft and additional fighter cover began checking in with her position. Viper Lead, this is Rescue 21. We have your position and are inbound with fuel and escort. Estimated time to your location is 12 minutes. What is your fuel state? Sarah almost laughed at the question. Rescue 21, my fuel state is approximately 0. I'm running on vapors and will probably be swimming in about 60 seconds. Copy that, Viper Lead. The destroyer USS Hampton is moving to intercept your projected glide path. If you have to eject, they'll be in position for immediate pickup. Sarah's engines finally flamed out just as the rescue aircraft called in. Her F-18 became a glider, and she began the careful process of stretching her glide as far as possible toward the approaching destroyer. Without engine power, she had only one chance to position herself for the best possible ejection point. The ocean rushed up toward her as she glided lower and lower. At 1,000 feet above the waves, Sarah made the decision to eject rather than risk a water landing with her aircraft. The ejection sequence was violent and disorienting, but her survival training took over as she found herself dangling beneath her parachute above the Pacific Ocean. The water was shockingly cold when she hit, despite her survival suit. But within minutes, she could hear the sound of helicopter rotors approaching, and rescue swimmers were in the water beside her. The USS Hampton had positioned itself perfectly for the pickup, and Sarah found herself being hauled aboard the destroyer less than 10 minutes after her ejection. As she sat in the ship's medical bay, wrapped in blankets and drinking hot coffee, Sarah finally had time to process what had just happened. She had started the morning on a routine patrol and ended it by shooting down 6 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. The engagement would go down as one of the most remarkable individual achievements in modern air warfare. Captain Morrison's voice came through the ship's communication system as he contacted her from the air station. Chen, I don't know how you did it, but you just made history out there. The entire engagement was recorded by multiple sources. 6 confirmed kills against overwhelming odds. The Pentagon is going to want to debrief you for months. But Sarah was thinking about something much more important than Pentagon debriefings or military history. She was thinking about keeping her promise to be home in time for Emma's piano practice. The destroyer was already heading toward port at maximum speed, and she would be home by evening after all. The USS Hampton's medical officer, Commander Patricia Walsh, finished her examination of Sarah and declared her fit for duty, despite the ordeal she had endured. Apart from some bruising from the high-G maneuvers and the ejection sequence, Sarah had come through the engagement remarkably well. But, Doctor, Walsh insisted she remain under observation during the voyage back to port, more for psychological evaluation than physical concerns. As word of the aerial engagement spread throughout the destroyer, Sarah found herself the center of attention from the entire crew. Sailors who had heard fragments of the radio transmissions during the battle approached her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The story of a single pilot shooting down 6 enemy aircraft in a running aerial battle was already taking on legendary proportions among the crew. Captain James Mitchell, the destroyer's commanding officer, visited Sarah in the medical bay to personally congratulate her on what he called the most extraordinary display of aerial combat skill he had witnessed in 25 years of naval service. Captain Mitchell had been monitoring the engagement from his ship's combat information center and had watched the radar tracks as Sarah systematically eliminated the enemy aircraft. "Lieutenant Chen," Captain Mitchell said, settling into a chair beside her bunk, "I've been in the Navy long enough to have seen some remarkable things, but what you accomplished out there today is going to be studied in military academies for decades. 6 confirmed kills against overwhelming odds, and you brought yourself home alive." Sarah appreciated the captain's words, but her mind was already focusing on the future, rather than dwelling on the battle. The psychological impact of taking human lives in combat was something she would have to process over time, but her immediate concern was returning to her normal life and her responsibilities as a mother. The destroyer's communication officer brought Sarah a secure satellite phone with a connection to Naval Air Station Oceana. Captain Morrison's voice came through clearly despite the distance, and Sarah could hear the relief and pride in his tone as they spoke. "Chen, I've been getting calls from the Pentagon every 15 minutes asking for details about your engagement. The preliminary assessment is that you shot down 6 aircraft of unknown origin in a running aerial battle that lasted almost 45 minutes. The intelligence value of this encounter is enormous, and there are going to be a lot of people who want to talk to you." Sarah understood the implications of what Morrison was telling her. The enemy aircraft she had encountered were of a type that intelligence services had not identified, and the tactics they had employed suggested a level of training and coordination that was concerning to military planners. Her detailed debriefing would be crucial for understanding the capabilities and intentions of whoever had launched the attack. But all of that would have to wait. Sarah's first priority was getting home to Emma and fulfilling her promise to help with piano practice. The ordinary concerns of daily life seemed more important than ever after spending the morning fighting for survival at 25,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. Rodriguez's voice came through the phone as Morrison patched him into the conversation. Her wingman had successfully landed his damaged aircraft at a forward airfield and was being treated for minor injuries sustained when his aircraft was hit. His first words were characteristic of his personality and their friendship. "Chen, next time we go on a milk run patrol, remind me to bring more ammunition. I spent all my time running for my life while you were out there putting on an air show for the history books." The humor in Rodriguez's voice told Sarah that he was going to be fine, both physically and mentally. The bond between military pilots who had shared combat was something that would connect them for the rest of their lives, and she was grateful that they had both survived to continue their friendship. As the destroyer steamed toward port, Sarah spent time writing her preliminary after-action report and trying to capture the tactical details of the engagement while they were still fresh in her memory. The sequence of events seemed almost unreal as she wrote them down, and she found herself double-checking her recollections against the electronic records from her aircraft. The enemy aircraft had been fast, maneuverable, and flown by skilled pilots. Their initial attack had been coordinated and professional, suggesting military training and experience, but they had made several tactical errors that Sarah had been able to exploit, and their equipment appeared to have limitations that her F-18 could overcome under extreme conditions. Doctor. Walsh returned to check on Sarah as evening approached and found her sitting by a porthole, looking out at the ocean, where the aerial battle had taken place just hours earlier. The psychiatrist in Dr. Walsh recognized the contemplative mood that often followed intense combat experiences. "How are you processing what happened out there, Lieutenant?" "Dr. Schoon," Walsh asked, settling into the chair beside Sarah. Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "I keep thinking about the enemy pilots who didn't make it home today. They were skilled aviators, probably with families and children of their own. But they chose to attack us in international waters, and I had to defend myself and protect Rodriguez." Walsh nodded approvingly at Sarah's response. "That's a healthy way to process combat. You did your job, protected your wingman, and eliminated a threat to friendly forces. The fact that you can acknowledge the human cost while understanding the necessity of your actions suggests you're handling this well."
As the lights of the Virginia coast became visible on the horizon, Sarah felt a sense of anticipation and relief that surprised her with its intensity. The routine patrol that had turned into historic aerial combat was finally ending, and she was going home to the people and responsibilities that really mattered to her. The destroyer docked at Norfolk Naval Base at 1900 hours, just as Sarah had promised Emma she would be home for dinner. Captain Morrison was waiting at the pier along with a small crowd of squadron personnel and media representatives who had gotten word of the engagement.
Sarah declined the immediate media interviews, explaining that she needed to get home to her daughter and would be available for official statements after her formal debriefing. Captain Morrison understood and arranged for a car to take Sarah directly home, avoiding the crowd that was already gathering to celebrate her achievement. The drive through familiar streets felt surreal after the morning's events. Sarah looked at the ordinary suburban landscape and found it hard to believe that just hours earlier she had been engaged in mortal combat above the Pacific Ocean. The contrast between the violence of aerial warfare and the peaceful normalcy of civilian life was jarring. Emma was waiting at the front door when Sarah's car pulled into the driveway, her small face pressed against the glass and her piano lesson books clutched in her hands. The sight of her daughter waiting for her promised return was more meaningful to Sarah than any military decoration or recognition she might receive for her actions.
"Mommy," Emma called out as Sarah walked up the front steps. "I practiced my Mozart piece 3 times today." "And Mrs. Penny's?"
Peterson said, "I'm ready for the recital." Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and feeling the solid reality of her small body. After a day of dealing with death and destruction, holding Emma felt like returning to life itself.
"That's wonderful, sweetheart," Sarah said, kneeling down to Emma's eye level. "I promised I'd be home to help you practice, and I always keep my promises." As they sat down at the piano together, Emma's small fingers finding the keys for her Mozart piece, Sarah realized that this moment was more important than any aerial victory.
She had fought to survive, not for military glory or personal achievement, but for the opportunity to continue being Emma's mother and to keep the promises she made to the people she loved. The phone would ring throughout the evening with calls from reporters and military officials. But Sarah ignored them all. She had more important things to do, like listening to Emma's piano practice and helping her daughter prepare for a school recital that was, in its own way, just as significant as any aerial engagement. By the time Emma was ready for bed, the day's events already seemed like something that had happened to someone else. Sarah tucked her daughter in and read her a bedtime story, just as she had done hundreds of times before. The routine normalcy of parenthood was exactly what she needed. After the extraordinary events of the day, as Sarah sat in her living room later that evening, finally allowing herself to process what had happened, she realized that she had found something more valuable than military glory in the skies above the Pacific Ocean. She had discovered that her love for Emma and her commitment to being a good mother were worth fighting for, and strong enough to bring her home safely from any battle.